Emma Clark sat quietly in her room, staring out the window at the bustling streets of Denver, Colorado. The sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a golden glow over the city. But her thoughts were far from the warmth it offered. As a teenager, Emma had always found herself torn between the life she lived and the life she wished she could escape. She lived in a modest home on Maple Street with her mother, Linda, a woman whose job as a street vendor was a constant source of embarrassment for Emma. Every day was a struggle to reconcile her love for her mother with the shame she felt when she looked at her. The small house they lived in, a once vibrant yellow that had now faded into a dull shade, was the very picture of modesty. The front yard was unkempt, the grass barely growing in patches, and the windowsill crowded with potted plants that Linda cared for with a dedication that Emma could never understand. Linda's job was simple, yet it provided the only income to support them. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, she would gather her food cart filled with homemade sandwiches, fresh fruit, and other snacks and head to the local park, where she would sell her goods to the morning joggers, tourists, and anyone who passed by. It was a job that Linda had taken with pride, but for Emma, it was a source of relentless embarrassment. At school, Emma could never quite escape the whispers. Her classmates would often make jokes about her mother, mocking the fact that she sold food on the street, as if that somehow made Linda less of a person. Emma hated it. She hated the looks, the whispered conversations, the way people would sometimes glance at her in pity when they saw her mother pushing her cart through the streets. It was as though her mother was invisible, defined only by the work she did. And Emma hated being associated with that. She remembered the times when she would come home from school, her stomach tight with anxiety, hoping that no one would see her mother setting up her cart outside their house. She could feel the weight of the stairs and hear the whispers, even when they weren't spoken aloud. She would walk past Linda, her mother's face always filled with warmth and love, and Emma would offer a forced smile before retreating to her room. She never wanted to talk about her mother's job. She never wanted to acknowledge the sacrifices Linda made for her. She never wanted to be the daughter of the street vendor. The guilt, though, was always there. It crept up on her when she saw how hard her mother worked, how long she stood on her feet every day, and how she came home every night with a tired smile, grateful for the few dollars she had earned. But Emma buried that guilt deep inside, locking it away behind walls of pride and shame. One day, as Emma walked home from school, she saw Linda pushing her cart down the street. It was a warm afternoon, and the park was busy with people enjoying the sun. Emma could see her mother, with her worn-out sneakers and faded apron, waving at a few regular customers as she carefully packed their orders. There was something about the way Linda held herself, so confident and unashamed of her work, that made Emma want to disappear. She quickened her pace, lowering her head as she passed her mother, hoping no one would see her. But Linda caught her eye, and her face lit up with a smile that Emma could never return. "Hi, sweetie," Linda called out, her voice filled with affection. "How was school today?" Emma didn't look up. She just kept walking, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Fine," she muttered, barely audible. Her mother's smile faltered for a moment, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she waved goodbye and returned to her customers. That night, as Emma sat in her room, she replayed the moment over and over again in her mind. She hated herself for how she had acted. She hated the way she couldn't bring herself to embrace her mother's love and dedication. And yet, every time she saw her mother's cart, every time she heard someone laugh at her mother's job, it felt like a dagger in her heart. She thought about the family gatherings. The gatherings that took place at her aunt's house, where the extended family would come together, sipping wine and making polite conversation. At those gatherings, Emma's mother was always the elephant in the room. No one would talk about Linda's job directly, but everyone knew. The way they looked at her, the way they whispered behind her back, Emma could feel it all. They considered Linda's work beneath them, something to be ashamed of, and that shame trickled down to Emma. Emma's father, Samuel Clark, wasn't much of a presence in her life. He had left when she was just a little girl, and though she had seen him occasionally, he was little more than a shadow to her. He didn't care about her or her mother, and the few times he did appear in her life, it was to offer empty promises that he would come back, but he never did. She had stopped counting the times she had heard him say he would try harder, only to disappear again. Her mother had always been the one to pick up the pieces, to care for her, to protect her. But Emma didn't appreciate that. She resented the way Linda kept telling her how lucky they were to have each other, how they were a family even without the wealth and status of others. All Emma wanted was for her life to be different, for her to fit in with the other kids at school whose parents were doctors, lawyers, and teachers. She wanted to escape from the life her mother had given her. But as time passed, Emma's resentment grew and the guilt intensified. The more she tried to distance herself from her mother, the more she realized that she was cutting herself off from the one person who truly cared for her. And yet, it wasn't enough to stop her from pushing her mother away. That evening, as she sat at her desk, Emma pulled out her notebook. She had an assignment due for school, and she needed to finish it. But as her pen hovered over the paper, her mind wandered. She thought about the pictures of herself that her mother kept, the old clippings from the newspaper that Linda had carefully cut out and saved. Emma had always ignored those pictures, those moments of pride that her mother kept for her. But now, sitting there in the quiet of her room, she realized how little she had appreciated them. She had won awards. She had received recognition for her achievements in school, in writing, and in community service. But her mother, who worked tirelessly to provide for her, had kept every single article, every scrap of paper that recognized Emma's success. She had kept them all in a small box, hidden away in the back of the closet. Emma stared at the box for a long time. Her heart ached. She didn't know why she had never seen it before. It was as if everything she had felt, the shame, the guilt, the resentment, was finally coming to the surface. She took a deep breath and walked over to the closet, pulling the box from the shelf. As she opened it, she was met with a flood of memories, old articles, ribbons, and certificates, each one a testament to her achievements. And there, nestled among them, were the clippings her mother had carefully saved, each one representing a small victory. Emma realized, for the first time, that her mother had been proud of her all along, even when Emma had turned her back on that pride. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the words on the yellowed pages. Her mother had always believed in her. But Emma had never believed in herself, and she had certainly never believed in the love her mother had given her. As the tears fell, Emma knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep running from the past, from the woman who had given everything to raise her. It was time to confront her feelings, to understand what she had lost, and to write the story of the woman who had always been her hero. Emma wiped the tears from her eyes as she continued to sift through the box, each paper pulling her deeper into reflection. She hadn't realized how much her mother had cherished her accomplishments, how Linda had stored away each of her awards as if they were treasures. And yet, all Emma had ever seen in them was the reflection of the life she wished she didn't have to live. As she stared at one of the articles, a piece from her high school graduation, where she had received an award for academic excellence, Emma couldn't help but notice the note that had been written across the top of the page in her mother's handwriting. "So proud of you, Emma. Keep shining. Love, Mom." The words hit her like a wave, and for the first time, Emma felt the weight of the love her mother had shown her, a love she had always taken for granted. Her mind began to race. How had she missed all this? How had she failed to see her mother's quiet dedication, her quiet strength? All these years, Emma had been so focused on the judgment of others, the embarrassment of having a mother who worked on the streets, that she had never seen the person her mother truly was, someone who gave everything, day after day, for the sake of her daughter. She had been so blinded by her own pride and shame that she couldn't see that the very thing she resented had been the very thing that made her mother a hero. With trembling hands, Emma carefully placed the articles and clippings back into the box. Her heart felt heavy, a mixture of regret and sorrow flooding her. She had been so quick to judge, so quick to look down on the very woman who had sacrificed so much for her. She had lived her life in denial of the love and care that had always been there, right in front of her. Emma sat back on the floor, the box resting in her lap, and she closed her eyes. The weight of the realization crushed her. Her mother had never once complained about her work. Linda had never once asked for sympathy or recognition for the hard work she did day in and day out. Emma had thought of her as nothing more than a street vendor, someone who was beneath her social status, beneath her future. But now, in the silence of her room, Emma understood something she had never understood before. Her mother was a woman who had fought every day of her life for what she had. And in doing so, she had taught Emma what it meant to be strong. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Emma whispered to herself, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I never saw you for who you truly were." Her heart ached as the weight of her mother's sacrifices settled deeper into her chest. It was as if a lifetime of guilt and regret were suddenly too much to bear. She had been so wrapped up in her own sense of shame that she had failed to see the woman who had always been there, the woman who had loved her unconditionally. It was then that the thought struck her. Writing a book. Writing a memoir about her mother, about Linda's strength, about the life they had shared. Emma knew deep down that this was what she had to do. She had to honor her mother's memory, her mother's sacrifices. She had to write about the woman who had been a hero in her own right, even if the world hadn't seen it. The tears came in waves now, but they were no longer tears of shame or regret. They were tears of release, of finally understanding the depth of her mother's love, of understanding the cost of everything her mother had done for her. It was a release from years of self-imposed guilt, from the false beliefs that had clouded her heart for so long. Emma stood up, wiping her eyes as she placed the box of memories back in the closet. She could feel a sense of purpose beginning to form, something she hadn't felt in years. She had a story to tell. Not just her own, but her mother's. She could already see the title in her mind, The Heroine Behind the Street Vendor Cart. It was perfect. It wasn't just a book about her mother. It was about everything Linda had been, everything she still was, even in death. Emma walked over to her desk and pulled out a fresh notebook. The pages were blank, waiting for her words. As she sat down and began to write, her mind swirled with thoughts of her mother. She wrote the first lines slowly, carefully, as if she was giving herself permission to speak the truth that had eluded her for so long. My mother was a street vendor. To most people, that might seem like a simple, unremarkable life. But to me, it was everything. She taught me strength, resilience, and the power of quiet love. She was a hero, not because of what she did for a living, but because of who she was. With the first words on the page, Emma knew this was just the beginning. She was no longer writing to fulfill an assignment or to prove something to the world. She was writing to heal herself, to honor the memory of the woman who had given everything for her. And, in the process, Emma would finally find the peace she had been searching for her entire life. As she continued to write, her heart felt lighter, and the guilt that had once burdened her began to fade. She knew that this journey, this act of writing her mother's story, wasn't just for the world. It was for herself. It was for Linda Clark, the street vendor who had taught her what it meant to truly love, without shame, without fear. In the quiet of her room, Emma began to see the truth that had been hidden all these years. Her mother had been the hero all along. As the days passed, Emma found herself immersed in the process of writing. She had never imagined how cathartic it could be to finally pour her heart into words. Each sentence she wrote was like peeling away layers of guilt and regret she had been carrying for years. There were moments when she would pause, her pen hovering above the paper, as memories of her mother flooded back in vivid detail. And with each memory, the love she had once failed to see grew clearer, stronger, and more undeniable. Her mother, Linda, had always been so selfless. She had sacrificed her own desires for Emma's well-being, putting in countless hours on the streets selling food, facing judgment and harsh words from the world around her, all so that Emma could have a better life. Linda never asked for anything in return. She never complained. To the outside world, she was just another street vendor, unimportant, insignificant. But to Emma, Linda had been everything. It was only now, through her writing, that Emma could truly grasp the enormity of her mother's quiet strength. One particular memory stood out to Emma, one that she hadn't thought about in years. It was a late summer evening when Emma was in high school. Linda had come home after a long day of selling her food cart items and, as usual, she had prepared dinner for them both. They sat down at their small kitchen table, the clatter of utensils and the sizzling sound of the stove the only noises breaking the silence between them. Emma had been quiet, her usual resistance to conversation hanging heavily in the air. She had just gotten a letter from a prestigious university, one she had applied to in secret, hoping to escape the life she had always known. She had been accepted, but there was a catch. The tuition fees were far beyond what they could afford. Emma hadn't told her mother yet, not wanting to burden her, but that night, Linda seemed to sense something was off. "Emma, honey, what's going on?" Linda had asked, placing a warm bowl of soup in front of her. "You've been distant lately. You know you can talk to me, right?" Emma had sighed, the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She wanted to tell her mother about the acceptance letter, about her dreams of going far away, about the life she longed for. But instead, she had lashed out. "Why do you always have to be so perfect?" Emma snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "I can't stand it anymore. I'm tired of living like this. I don't want to be the daughter of a street vendor. I want to escape, and I want you to stop pretending like everything is fine." Linda had been quiet, her eyes soft with understanding, but there was a sadness there too. She hadn't reacted angrily or hurtfully, as Emma had expected. Instead, she just nodded, her hand gently resting on Emma's. "Emma," she said softly, "I never wanted you to feel ashamed of me. I know my job isn't glamorous, but I do it because I love you. I do it because I want you to have everything I didn't. I may not have much, but what I do have, I will always give to you." Emma had looked away, unable to meet her mother's gaze. She felt her chest tighten as guilt settled over her like a heavy cloak. But she didn't know how to tell her mother how sorry she was, how much she wished she could take back the words she had said. Now, sitting in her room, Emma could almost hear her mother's voice again, the softness of her words, the understanding in her tone. Linda had never asked for Emma to be ashamed of her. It was Emma who had imposed that shame onto herself, born from the fear of how others saw her, how others saw her mother. But the truth was, her mother had always been proud of her. She had always believed in Emma, even when Emma couldn't believe in herself. As Emma wrote about that night, she realized something profound. Linda hadn't just given her physical things, shelter, food, warmth. She had given Emma something much more valuable, the strength to face the world, the love that had held them both together through tough times. And all this time, Emma had taken it for granted. It was the realization that her mother's sacrifices were not just for her to escape, but for Emma to become someone better, someone who could one day make a difference, someone who could understand the true value of love and sacrifice. It was the realization that Linda had wanted more for Emma, not because she wanted to escape her own life, but because she believed in Emma's potential. The more Emma wrote, the more she felt the weight lifting from her heart. There were still so many stories to tell, stories of her mother's quiet courage, her unspoken sacrifices, and her strength that had been invisible to Emma until now. There were stories about how Linda had faced the harsh words of strangers without flinching, how she had kept her head high even when society looked down on her. She had been a true hero, not because she fought battles in grand ways, but because she fought every day for the love of her daughter, for their future. Emma paused in her writing and looked around the room. The walls, once so confining, now felt like they were filled with possibilities. She had been so focused on escaping her life, on trying to leave behind the very things that had shaped her, that she hadn't realized that everything she needed to become the person she was meant to be was right there in front of her. It wasn't the title or the prestige that mattered. It was the love, the lessons, and the strength that Linda had instilled in her. And that, Emma knew, was something no one could ever take away. She picked up her pen again and began to write the next chapter. her heart now full of love and gratitude for the woman who had always been there, even when Emma hadn't been able to see it. The words flowed easily now, as if her mother's spirit was guiding her hand, helping her tell the story that had been waiting to be told. As the hours passed, Emma lost track of time, writing deep into the night. She felt as though she were no longer alone in the room. Her mother's presence was there with her, not as a memory or a ghost, but as a living, breathing part of her heart. The realization that she could finally share Linda's story, that she could honor the woman who had shaped her life, filled her with a sense of peace she had never known. When Emma finally put down her pen and closed the notebook, she knew that she had made the right decision. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more struggles to overcome. But one thing was certain, Emma Clark was no longer ashamed of who she was or where she came from. She was proud of her mother, proud of her heritage, and proud of the woman she was becoming. And with every word she wrote, she was healing piece by piece. She took a deep breath and smiled softly to herself. For the first time in years, Emma felt at home in her own life. And it was only the beginning. As the weeks passed, Emma's writing became a solace and a sanctuary. The more she wrote, the clearer her thoughts became. And the more she was able to reflect on the life she had lived with her mother. She began to realize that each memory, each moment of pain and joy, was a thread that had woven the fabric of who she was today. And with each page of her memoir, the weight of the past seemed to lighten just a little more. Emma continued to work on her book during every spare moment. Her small apartment in Denver, which had once felt suffocating and cold, now felt like a quiet refuge where she could express her deepest emotions. The memories of her mother, of Linda's unwavering love and sacrifice, filled every corner of the room. Emma had placed a photograph of her mother on her desk, a picture from one of the rare moments when they had spent time together, before Emma's shame had clouded her heart. Linda had been smiling in the picture, the same warm, gentle smile that Emma had come to cherish in the memories she was writing about. It was as though, in telling her mother's story, Emma was not just uncovering the truth about Linda, but also rediscovering herself. She found herself growing in ways she hadn't expected. As the chapters filled up, Emma's view of her past began to shift. No longer did she see her mother's job as something to be ashamed of. Instead, she began to see the beauty and dignity in it, the sacrifices Linda made to ensure Emma had a chance at a better life. One afternoon, as Emma sat at her desk, typing away, she received a message from Rachel. It was a simple message, a check-in to see how she was doing, but Emma could feel the weight of the words. Rachel had been her closest friend for years, someone who had witnessed the distance Emma had always put between herself and her mother. Rachel had seen the struggles Emma had faced in reconciling her love for her mother with the shame she carried. Now, as Emma sat there, writing about Linda's life, she could feel the distance between them shrinking. She typed a quick reply to Rachel, her fingers moving across the keys with ease. "I've been writing about Mom. I'm finally telling her story. Rachel, I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm writing the truth, and I'm starting to realize just how much I owe her." The response came almost immediately. "I'm so proud of you, Emma. I know this has been hard, but you're doing something amazing. Your mom would be so proud of you." Emma smiled softly, the words filling her heart with warmth. She hadn't expected Rachel to understand just how deeply this journey had affected her, but it was comforting to know her friend was there, cheering her on. Over the next few days, Emma focused on one of the most significant chapters in her memoir, the chapter about the day her mother died. It was a day that had forever changed her life. The day when everything she had taken for granted was suddenly ripped away. Writing about that day, about the accident, and about the overwhelming grief she had felt, was cathartic. But it was also painful. Emma had never fully allowed herself to grieve her mother's death. For years, she had buried the pain, not wanting to face the overwhelming emotions that had come with it. But now, as she wrote, she felt as though she was finally able to confront her grief, to feel the weight of that loss and, in a way, to let go of the guilt that had haunted her for so long. The day her mother died had been like any other. Linda had gone to the market that morning, as she always did, pushing her cart with a quiet determination. Emma had been at school, unaware that anything was wrong. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that Emma had received the call. Her mother had been hit by a car while crossing the street, and despite the best efforts of paramedics, she didn't make it. Emma hadn't been there to hold her hand, to say goodbye. She hadn't been there when her mother needed her the most. For years, Emma had carried that guilt with her. She had never allowed herself to truly grieve because she felt that she hadn't been a good daughter. She had distanced herself from Linda in her final years, always too caught up in her own life to show the love and appreciation her mother deserved. And then, just like that, her mother was gone. Emma had never forgiven herself for not being there, for not recognizing her mother's strength and love until it was too late. But as she wrote, she realized that her mother had never needed her to be perfect. Linda had loved her unconditionally, regardless of her mistakes. And it was that love, that unbreakable bond, that Emma had finally come to understand. As Emma continued to write, the floodgates of her emotions opened. She allowed herself to feel everything she had kept bottled up for so long: the sadness, the anger, the regret, and finally, the acceptance. She allowed herself to forgive herself, to acknowledge the mistakes she had made, and to honor her mother's memory in a way she had never done before. When Emma reached the final chapter of her memoir, she sat back in her chair, exhausted but fulfilled. She had written the truth. She had written a story of love, sacrifice, and redemption. She had written about the woman who had shaped her life, the woman who had been a hero in every sense of the word. And through this journey, Emma had rediscovered herself. She was no longer a daughter burdened by shame. She was a daughter who could stand proud, knowing that the woman who had raised her was someone to be celebrated, not hidden away. The book, The Heroine Behind the Street Vendor Cart, was more than just a tribute to her mother. It was a celebration of the woman Linda had been, and a reflection of the journey Emma had taken to understand the depth of her love. Emma knew that this was just the beginning. Writing the memoir was only the first step in her healing process. She would continue to honor her mother, to carry her memory with her every day, and to share the story of the woman who had given everything for her. As Emma closed her laptop, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey of writing had been painful, but it had been worth every moment. Her heart was lighter, and her connection to her mother was stronger than ever. The past no longer defined her. Emma Clark was ready to step into the future, not as the ashamed daughter of a street vendor, but as a woman who was proud of where she came from and proud of the hero who had shaped her life. With a deep breath, Emma looked at the photograph of her mother on the desk and whispered, "Thank you, Mom. You will always be my hero." In the days that followed, Emma felt a quiet transformation take place within herself. Writing her memoir had been a journey of self-discovery, but it also sparked a sense of purpose. She no longer viewed her life through the lens of guilt and shame. The past, once so heavy and clouded by regret, now felt like a series of stepping stones that had led her to this moment of clarity. Emma was finally able to see the full picture of her life, how her mother's love, sacrifices, and resilience had shaped her into the woman she was becoming. With the manuscript of The Heroine Behind the Street Vendor Cart complete, Emma began the next phase of her journey, finding a publisher. It was an intimidating process, one that brought back some of the self-doubt she had long struggled with. But this time, she was different. This time, she believed in herself, in the story she had to tell. Her mother's story deserved to be heard, and so did Emma's. She began sending out query letters to agents and publishers. Each letter was carefully crafted, just as the memoir had been, filled with the hope and determination that had been absent from her life for so long. The first responses she received were polite rejections, but Emma didn't let them discourage her. She knew the road to success would be filled with obstacles, but she was ready to face them. Meanwhile, her relationship with her extended family had begun to change as well. Emma had always kept her distance from them, particularly because of their judgment of her mother's work. But after completing her memoir, something shifted. She felt a newfound strength, an inner resolve to stand up for herself and for her mother. One evening, she received an invitation to a family gathering at her aunt's house. It was the first time in years that she had been invited, and at first, Emma hesitated. She wasn't sure she was ready to face the family that had never understood her or her mother. But this time, things were different. She had found her voice, and she was no longer willing to hide who she was or where she came from. She decided to go. As Emma arrived at her aunt's house, she was greeted with polite smiles and the usual small talk. The conversations were light, nothing too personal. But Emma could sense the tension in the air, the underlying judgment that still lingered, just beneath the surface. It was always there, like a silent weight. She had expected it, but she was ready for it now. The evening wore on, and Emma found herself standing in the kitchen, quietly watching the people around her. Her aunt, a woman who had always looked down on Linda's work, came over to her. "Emma," her aunt began, "I've heard you've been writing. What's it about, if you don't mind me asking?" Emma took a deep breath. She could feel her heart racing, but she didn't look away. She met her aunt's eyes and spoke calmly, but with conviction. "It's about my mother," she said. "It's about Linda, about her life, her strength, and the love she gave me. I'm writing a memoir about her." Her aunt raised an eyebrow, surprised. "A memoir? About your mother?" "Yes," Emma replied firmly. "She was my hero, and I think it's time the world knew that." There was a moment of silence, and Emma could see the gears turning in her aunt's mind. For the first time, Emma didn't feel the weight of judgment from her family. There was a pause, and then her aunt nodded, her expression softening. Perhaps you're right," her aunt said slowly. "I never really understood her, but she always cared for you. And I suppose that's what matters most." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emma felt a small but significant shift in the air, an opening, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, her family could begin to understand. Maybe they could see Linda for the person she truly was. As the evening continued, Emma realized that this moment marked the beginning of something new. Her relationship with her family would never be the same, but it didn't have to be perfect. What mattered was that she had found her voice, and in doing so, had begun to reclaim the story of her mother and herself. The weeks turned into months, and Emma continued to work on her book. She had found a small independent publisher who believed in her story. And soon, the heroine behind the street vendor cart was ready to be printed. The process wasn't easy. There were revisions, edits, and moments of doubt. But Emma held on to the belief that this story needed to be shared, not just for her mother, but for every person who had ever felt misunderstood or overlooked. The day the book was released, Emma felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The book was small, modest even, but it was hers. It was the culmination of years of struggle, pain, and growth. It was a testament to the woman who had given everything for her, and to the woman Emma had become because of it. In the months that followed, the book began to gain attention. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its audience. Readers began to share their stories with Emma, stories of their own mothers, of their own struggles with shame, pride, and love. The letters and messages poured in, and Emma realized that her story was resonating with people far beyond her expectations. But more importantly, Emma had found peace. She had healed the rift between herself and her mother's memory. Through writing, she had come to understand the true meaning of love and sacrifice, and she had learned to embrace the woman who had raised her without shame or regret. The healing didn't stop with the publication of the book. It continued in the small, everyday moments, in the way Emma looked at herself in the mirror, in the way she stood taller, more confident, and in the way she now spoke about her mother with pride. She no longer hid from her past. Instead, she carried it with her, honoring the lessons Linda had taught her. As Emma sat in her small apartment one evening, her book on the table beside her, she smiled softly. She knew that her mother was with her in spirit. And for the first time in her life, She felt whole. The journey had been long and filled with pain, but it had also been filled with love. Emma had learned that heroes didn't always wear capes. Sometimes, they simply carried a food cart down the street every day and loved without asking for anything in return. And that was the true story of her mother, the heroine behind the street vendor cart. Months passed, and the story of Emma and her mother began to spread, not just in the local community, but across the country. The book, The Heroine Behind the Street Vendor Cart, had become a quiet success. It didn't garner the fame of a mainstream bestseller, but its impact was undeniable. The memoir spoke to anyone who had ever felt marginalized, misunderstood, or ashamed of their roots. Readers from all walks of life began to send Emma messages, telling her how her mother's story had inspired them to look at their own families and their own lives differently. Emma felt a growing sense of responsibility. Her mother's story had opened up something much larger than just her own personal healing. It had struck a chord with so many people who had experienced similar struggles. There were mothers working tirelessly in the background, overlooked by society, whose strength and love went unrecognized. There were children, like Emma once was, who had been too ashamed of their humble beginnings to see the beauty in them. And there were families, broken and distant, who found themselves reconnecting through the simple yet profound act of understanding and forgiveness. With every letter she received, Emma felt the weight of her decision to write her memoir becoming more meaningful. She was no longer just a daughter mourning her mother's death. She was part of a larger conversation. One about family, love, sacrifice, and the power of seeing the humanity in those who are often overlooked. As the months turned into a year since the release of the book, Emma was invited to speak at various community events. At first, she had been nervous about public speaking, unsure of how to articulate the depth of her feelings. But the more she spoke, the more she realized that her voice mattered. She wasn't just telling her story, she was sharing a universal truth. Her mother's life, as simple as it had seemed, had been a testament to what it meant to be human. And in sharing that, Emma had found a sense of purpose she had never expected. One particular event stood out to Emma. It was a speaking engagement at a community center in Denver, where the audience was made up mostly of mothers who worked multiple jobs, children who had experienced hardships, and people who were struggling to find their own voices. The room was small, filled with warm, eager faces, all looking for something to inspire them, to help them feel seen. Emma stood at the podium, her hands trembling at first. But as she began to speak, something inside her clicked. She wasn't just sharing her mother's story anymore. She was sharing the story of all the people who had lived through similar struggles, who had felt the sting of judgment and shame, but who had persevered despite it all. Life doesn't always look the way we expect, Emma began, her voice steady as she looked out at the audience. My mother was a street vendor. People looked down on her because of her job, because of how she made a living. But what they didn't see was the love and sacrifice she put into every single day of her life. What they didn't see was the heart of a woman who would do anything to make sure her daughter had a chance at something better. She paused, letting her words sink in. I grew up ashamed of my mother's work. I thought it was beneath me. I thought I could escape the life she gave me, that I could be better than it. But in doing that, I missed the most important lesson she ever taught me. And that lesson is this. It's not the work you do, or how others see you, that defines your worth. It's how you love, how you give, and how you care. That's what makes you a hero. The room was silent as Emma finished speaking, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, the applause began. It was quiet at first, but soon it grew louder, a wave of appreciation that filled Emma's heart with gratitude. She hadn't expected this kind of response. She had only wanted to share her story, to honor her mother's memory. But in doing so, she had sparked something in others. After the event, a woman approached Emma. She was older, with kind eyes and hands worn from years of hard work. She held a copy of Emma's book, her fingers gently tracing the cover. Thank you, the woman said, her voice filled with emotion. Your mother's story, it made me see my own life differently. I've been working as a janitor for years, just trying to make ends meet, and I've always felt like I was invisible. But after hearing you speak, I realized I'm not invisible. I'm doing important work. I'm not just cleaning, I'm providing for my family. And that matters. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she looked at the woman. This was why she had written the book. This was the legacy her mother had left her, the ability to make people feel seen, to help them understand their worth, no matter their circumstances. Emma reached out and took the woman's hand, squeezing it gently. "You're seen," she said softly. "And what you do matters." As she left the event that evening, Emma felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She had spent so much of her life running from the truth, hiding from the things that made her uncomfortable. But now, she understood that the very things she had once been ashamed of, her mother's job, her humble beginnings, were the things that had shaped her into the person she was meant to be. She was no longer defined by shame. She was defined by love, by sacrifice, and by the strength that ran through her veins, passed down from her mother. The book, the heroine behind the street vendor cart, continued to resonate with readers. It wasn't just a story about Emma's mother, it was a story about every person who had ever felt like they didn't belong. Every person who had ever been judged based on their circumstances. And through it, Emma had found her place in the world. She had found her voice, her purpose, and most importantly, she had found the peace she had longed for. Her mother's memory was no longer a source of pain, but a source of pride. Linda Clark, the woman who had sold food on the streets, had been a true hero in every sense of the word. And Emma had finally come to see that. As she sat down to write the final words of her memoir, Emma smiled to herself. She had done it. She had shared the truth, and in doing so, she had healed not just herself, but others as well. The book wasn't just about a mother's love, it was about the power of seeing the value in every person, no matter their circumstances. It was about understanding that everyone, in their own way, was a hero. And as Emma closed her notebook for the last time, she whispered softly to the photo of her mother on her desk, "Thank you, Mom. I see you now." Months passed since the book's release, and Emma had found herself in a space she had never imagined. The quiet success of the heroine behind the street vendor cart had brought her closer to herself, but it also connected her to a community of people who had, like her, once felt unseen. With the growing attention, Emma's life began to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the book anymore. It was about how it had become a bridge for many to rediscover their own sense of worth. Emma had always been reserved, but now, she found herself actively seeking ways to give back to the community. The letters she received from readers were more than just appreciation for her mother's story. Many people shared their own experiences, stories of being judged, of struggling to make ends meet, of raising children in difficult circumstances, and of battling the societal pressures that forced them to hide who they were. One letter stood out to Emma. It was from a woman named Maria who had been a single mother for most of her life. Maria had raised her son while working 2 jobs, one as a waitress and the other cleaning offices at night. Maria's letter detailed how she had been constantly belittled by her family for not being able to give her son the life they thought he deserved. She wrote about the shame she had carried for years, constantly feeling inferior to other mothers whose lives seemed perfect. But after reading Emma's book, Maria wrote that she finally felt seen. "I've never felt like anyone understood me before." Maria's letter read, "But you made me realize that what I do is important. I may not have a fancy job or a big house, but I'm giving my son everything I have. You gave me the courage to stop feeling ashamed of myself." Reading those words was a turning point for Emma. The book had done more than just heal her own wounds. It had helped other people find the strength to embrace who they were, to find pride in their lives, just as she had done with her mother's story. Emma knew that this was what her journey was about, spreading that love, understanding, and acceptance. Inspired by the messages she had received and the people whose lives had been touched by her mother's story, Emma decided to take another step. She founded a nonprofit organization called Visible Voices, dedicated to supporting people who worked in underappreciated and undervalued jobs. The organization aimed to provide resources and support to workers, whether they were street vendors, janitors, waitstaff, or others, by offering scholarships, job training, and mental health services. The first event the organization held was a fundraiser to benefit workers in her community. It was a small gathering, but it was full of passion and purpose. Emma stood at the podium, surrounded by people who had been touched by her book and the stories it had sparked. The event raised money for the nonprofit and also served as a platform to recognize and celebrate workers who were often overlooked. When it was Emma's turn to speak, she felt her mother's presence more strongly than ever. As she stood there, facing the crowd, Emma realized that the pain, the shame, and the guilt she had carried for so long had all led her to this moment, a moment where she was not just telling her mother's story, but living it, spreading it, and making it a part of the world. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," Emma began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "To feel like your work doesn't matter, like who you are doesn't matter. But I'm here to tell you that you do matter. You're seen. And your story deserves to be heard." There was a quiet pause in the room as her words settled. And then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was an eruption of support. People stood and cheered, and Emma could see the tears in their eyes, tears of relief, of validation, of knowing they had value. For the first time, they felt like someone cared about their lives, about their struggles. Emma felt overwhelmed by the power of the moment. Her book had started as a personal journey, a way for her to understand her mother and her own feelings of shame. But it had blossomed into something far bigger, a movement that celebrated the everyday heroes who made the world go round, the unsung people who worked tirelessly without recognition. Her mother had been one of those heroes, and now, through Emma's words and the nonprofit, more people were beginning to realize that they too were heroes. In the weeks following the fundraiser, Emma's organization gained more traction. She was invited to speak at conferences, participate in panels, and collaborate with other nonprofits that supported workers in underappreciated fields. The visibility of the heroine behind the street vendor cart gave Emma the platform to reach even more people. She was invited to appear on podcasts and TV shows, where she shared her mother's story and how it had changed her life. But no matter how much recognition she received, Emma never lost sight of what had brought her here, her mother's love and sacrifice. One day, Emma received a message from the publisher who had helped bring her book to life. It was an email about a potential documentary project based on the heroine behind the street vendor cart. The film would explore the lives of street vendors and workers in underappreciated jobs, weaving in Emma's story and her mother's legacy. The idea was to bring the message of the book to a larger audience, one that could be reached through the powerful medium of film. After much thought, Emma agreed to the project. It felt like another step in her journey of honoring her mother and the people who had been overlooked for far too long. The documentary, once completed, would reach millions of people, giving them the opportunity to see the unsung heroes in their communities, just as Emma had finally seen her mother. As the project came together, Emma found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She had started this journey feeling lost, disconnected from her roots, and ashamed of her mother. Now, she was a voice for the voiceless, a champion for those whose stories were often ignored. And she owed it all to the woman who had given her life, the woman who had never sought recognition, but had earned it in every way imaginable. In the quiet moments when Emma sat alone, she could almost hear her mother's voice, as if Linda was still beside her, guiding her forward. "You've done good, Emma," she imagined her mother saying. "You've made me proud." And Emma smiled softly to herself, knowing that she had finally made peace with the past, embraced her mother's legacy, and created a future filled with purpose and meaning. She had become the hero of her own story, and in doing so, had honored the true hero behind the street vendor cart. As the documentary project progressed, Emma found herself taking a deeper dive into her mother's life than she had ever expected. It wasn't just about filming the streets where her mother had worked or highlighting the daily struggles of other street vendors. It was about capturing the soul of her mother's story, the heart of her humble but profound journey. Emma spent countless hours going through old family photographs, interviews with old friends of her mother, and even speaking to the customers who remembered Linda from her days on the streets. Every conversation, every photo, every story added layers to the portrait of the woman she had once taken for granted. The process was emotional, often overwhelming. Some days, Emma would sit for hours in front of the screen, watching raw footage of her mother, now just a distant memory in a series of candid shots. There were moments when she would pause, overcome by grief, realizing just how much time she had wasted, how much more she could have appreciated her mother while she was still here. But then there were moments of clarity, where Emma saw Linda not just as a mother, but as the woman who had lived a life of quiet dignity, love, and resilience, qualities that had shaped Emma into who she was today. One day, as she sat in the editing room with the director, Emma watched a particular interview with an elderly man named Joseph. He had been one of Linda's regular customers, a kind-hearted retiree who always made it a point to buy lunch from her, regardless of whether he was hungry. He spoke about Linda with such fondness, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Linda, he said, she had a way of making everyone feel like they mattered. Every time I saw her, she'd offer me a warm smile and a kind word. But it wasn't just her food that made her special, it was her heart. She didn't just sell food. She gave people a piece of herself. The words hit Emma like a wave. She felt the familiar pang of guilt and love for the mother she had now come to understand so deeply, and guilt for not having recognized her mother's greatness sooner. But as the interview continued, she realized something important. Her mother had never needed anyone to recognize her greatness. She had lived her life with a quiet strength, not for accolades or recognition, but because that was who she was. Linda's kindness wasn't for show, it was simply how she lived. Emma glanced at the director, who was nodding in agreement as they watched the footage. "That's the essence of her," Emma whispered. She gave without expecting anything in return. The director smiled. "That's the story we're telling. The story of selfless love, of people who do the work that no one sees, but who make the world a better place in their own way." It was in that moment, as Emma watched the interview, that she fully grasped the scope of her mother's impact. Linda had changed lives not with grand gestures, but through her everyday actions, her kindness, her smile, and her unwavering devotion to providing for Emma. And now, through Emma's memoir and this documentary, her story was being shared with the world. The filming and editing process continued, and soon, the documentary began to take shape. Emma watched as the story of her mother's life unfolded on the screen. It wasn't just about the struggles, it was about the triumphs. It was about the love Linda had poured into every meal she prepared, every conversation she had with a customer, and every sacrifice she had made to give Emma the life she had. It was a tribute not only to Linda's life, but to every unsung hero who worked quietly in the background, overlooked by society, but essential to its functioning. As the documentary neared completion, Emma began to prepare for the premiere. The event would be held in a small theater in Denver, and it would be an intimate affair, close friends, family, and people who had been touched by the book and the message behind it. It wasn't going to be a glitzy Hollywood event, but Emma knew that it didn't need to be. What mattered was that the story was being shared, and that her mother's legacy was being honored in a way that she had never imagined. The night of the premiere arrived, and Emma found herself standing in front of the theater, taking a deep breath before entering. The familiar nerves crept in, the fear of judgment, the fear that people wouldn't understand. But she pushed them aside. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about Linda. It was about celebrating the life of a woman who had loved unconditionally, given endlessly, and whose story deserved to be told. Inside the theater, the room was filled with warmth. People chatted quietly, their faces lit with anticipation. Emma spotted Rachel in the crowd, and they exchanged a smile before Rachel hugged her tightly. You did it, Emma, Rachel whispered. You've made your mom proud. Emma nodded, a tear escaping her eye. I hope so. I really do. As the lights dimmed and the documentary began, Emma sat back in her seat. The opening scenes played images of Linda's food cart on the streets of Denver, her hands carefully preparing sandwiches, and the smiles of the people who frequented her stand. Then, as the documentary delved into the heart of Linda's life, Emma watched as the story of her mother unfolded in a way that felt so familiar, yet so new. For the first time, Emma saw her mother as more than just her mom. She saw her as the woman she had always been, someone who had given everything for others, without asking for anything in return. The documentary didn't just tell the story of Linda Clark, it told the story of every person who worked tirelessly, often unnoticed, to make the world a better place. It showed how love, no matter how small or quiet, had the power to transform lives. As the film reached its conclusion, the credits rolled, and the room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, the applause began. Emma sat there, overwhelmed by emotion, as the sound of clapping filled the room. It wasn't just applause for the documentary, it was for Linda, for her legacy, and for every person who had ever worked in the shadows, never asking for recognition. After the screening, people came up to Emma, sharing their own stories of parents, family members, and friends who had worked quietly behind the scenes. The room was filled with conversations about the unsung heroes in everyone's lives, and Emma realized that this was what it was all about, sharing these stories, giving these people the recognition they deserved, and finding a way to honor their sacrifices. As the evening drew to a close, Emma stood outside the theater, gazing at the stars above. It had been an emotional night, but it had been worth every moment. She had come full circle, once ashamed of her mother, once burdened by guilt, and now standing proud, her heart full of gratitude. Her mother had never needed the recognition. But now, through Emma, the world had come to see the true hero behind the street vendor cart. With a deep breath, Emma whispered into the quiet night, "Thank you, Mom. You were always my hero." And for the first time, she felt at peace, knowing that she had honored her mother's legacy in the way she had always deserved. The months that followed the documentary premiere were filled with a sense of purpose and peace that Emma had never known before. The success of the heroine behind the street vendor cart, both in its book and film form, became a stepping stone to something larger, something more than she had initially imagined when she began this journey. The messages from readers and viewers continued to pour in, each one a testament to the power of her mother's story. Through the success of the documentary and the nonprofit Emma had founded, Visible Voices, she had built something tangible that would outlast her. The organization had grown rapidly, offering scholarships, mentorship programs, and emotional support to workers in underappreciated jobs, just as her mother had once done with her own hard work and sacrifices. People were beginning to feel seen and valued, just as Emma's mother had made her feel valued when she was growing up, even in the most difficult circumstances. Emma's days were now a blend of managing Visible Voices, participating in public speaking engagements, and continuing to connect with people whose lives had been touched by her mother's story. Though it was fulfilling, it was also demanding. At times, she found herself overwhelmed by the responsibilities she had taken on. She had become not just a voice for the voiceless, but a leader in a movement she hadn't expected to create. Yet, Emma never lost sight of why she was doing it, to honor Linda, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her and who had taught her the most important lesson of all, that love and resilience have the power to change the world. One afternoon, as Emma was sitting at her desk, going over the latest proposals for the nonprofit, she received a call that would mark another turning point in her journey. It was from an old family friend, Martha, who had known Linda for years. Martha was someone who had always admired Linda's quiet strength and had watched her struggle to make ends meet while providing for Emma. "Emma," Martha said, her voice a mixture of excitement and emotion, "I just heard from a museum in Denver. They want to honor your mother's legacy. They're planning a special exhibit that will highlight the contributions of street vendors to the city's culture, and they want to include your mom's story. They want to showcase her food cart, the photos, and the materials from the documentary. It's going to be a permanent part of the museum's collection. Emma felt a lump form in her throat as the magnitude of what Martha was saying sank in. A museum exhibit? For her mother? The thought was almost too much to comprehend. Her mind flashed to the images of Linda's food cart, the countless hours her mother had spent on the streets of Denver, just doing what she loved, providing for her daughter, one sandwich at a time. Linda had never once dreamed of such recognition. But now, the city was acknowledging her. A woman who had always been seen as nothing more than a street vendor by many was about to be celebrated as a cornerstone of Denver's community. That's incredible, Emma said, her voice cracking. I didn't know what to say. I'm just so overwhelmed. Martha chuckled softly. I can only imagine. But I think your mom would have loved this. She always gave so much, never asking for anything in return. Now, the world will see her for what she truly was, a hero in her own right. Emma closed her eyes, trying to process the news. A museum exhibit. It felt like such a monumental recognition of the quiet heroism her mother had shown throughout her life. The thought of Linda's food cart, once a symbol of Emma's embarrassment, now becoming a part of history, it was more than she had ever dreamed possible. After a few moments of reflection, Emma replied, Yes, let's do it. I'll help in any way I can. This is exactly what she deserves. In the weeks that followed, Emma worked closely with the museum curators, gathering photos, stories, and artifacts to be included in the exhibit. As she sorted through the materials, old newspaper clippings of local food festivals Linda had participated in, handwritten recipes, and even the worn-out apron Linda had always worn, Emma felt her heart swell with pride. She hadn't realized just how much her mother had contributed to the community, how much she had quietly affected the lives of so many people who had never fully understood her. The day the exhibit opened was a pivotal moment in Emma's life. The museum had organized a special ceremony to honor Linda, and the room was filled with people who had known her, customers, friends, and fellow workers from the community. It wasn't a grand gala, but it didn't need to be. The people in that room knew the true value of Linda's work, and for them, this was a celebration of the quiet dignity she had carried through her life. As Emma stood by the display, looking at the photographs of her mother, she felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never imagined that her mother's life would be honored in such a way. But now, as she read the stories written on the walls of the exhibit, she saw her mother through a new lens. Linda wasn't just a woman who had worked on the streets. She was an integral part of the community. A woman who had given without expecting anything in return and had loved unconditionally. Emma was surrounded by people, but she felt the presence of her mother more than ever. She could almost hear Linda's voice in her mind, telling her how proud she was. Emma realized that this exhibit, this recognition, wasn't just about her mother. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, misunderstood, or judged. It was about honoring the quiet heroes in every community, the ones who might not wear capes or receive accolades, but whose contributions were no less valuable. At the end of the ceremony, Emma was invited to speak. She stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment filling her chest. She looked around at the faces in the crowd, the people who had shared their stories with her, the people who had known her mother. And with a deep breath, Emma spoke. Thank you all for being here today to honor my mother, Linda Clark. I've spent so much of my life ashamed of where I came from, ashamed of the work she did. But as I stand here today, I see something I didn't see before, my mother's strength, her love, her resilience. And it is that strength that I carry with me now. My mother taught me that our worth is not measured by the job we do, but by the love we give, the kindness we show, and the sacrifices we make for others. And in honoring her, we honor all the quiet heroes who work day in and day out, never asking for recognition, but always giving so much. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then the applause began, filling the room with a sense of collective appreciation. Emma felt a wave of emotion wash over her, gratitude, pride, and an overwhelming sense of peace. This was what her mother had always deserved. And through Emma's journey, the world was finally beginning to see her, just as Emma had always seen her now. As the evening drew to a close, Emma walked through the museum, her hand resting lightly on the display of Linda's food cart. She could almost hear her mother's voice again, so clear and strong in her heart. Emma knew that her mother would always be with her, in every story she told, in every life she touched, and in every quiet moment of love and sacrifice that would continue to ripple through the community. Linda Clark may have been a street vendor, but she had been, in every sense of the word, a hero. And Emma, standing there in the museum, finally understood that her mother had never needed the world's recognition. She had always been a hero, and Emma had finally found a way to honor that heroism for herself, for her mother, and for the world to see. As the days after the museum exhibit settled into a quiet reflection, Emma continued to find herself in awe of how far her journey had taken her. The recognition of Linda's life had touched so many people, but more than that, it had shifted something deep within Emma. She no longer felt the weight of shame she once carried. Instead, she felt pride in her mother's strength, pride in their journey together, and pride in the work she was doing through Visible Voices. Her nonprofit was thriving, having expanded to offer more direct support to those in need, especially for women and families in underserved communities. Scholarships were being granted to young students working multiple jobs. Mental health services were being provided to those who had long been neglected, and Emma herself had become a voice for the quiet heroes, the street vendors, the janitors, the waitstaff, the backbone of the community. The work, while fulfilling, was still challenging. There were moments when Emma felt overwhelmed by the constant responsibility, but she was no longer burdened by the weight of her mother's memory. Instead, it had become a source of strength. She was walking the path that Linda had carved out for her, and it was one that felt more meaningful every day. One afternoon, Emma received a phone call that would forever change her trajectory. It was a well-known public figure in the social justice community, a woman who had been following Emma's work and the story of her mother's legacy. The woman, Sophia Graves, was a renowned advocate for workers' rights and had recently taken an interest in Visible Voices. "Emma, I've been watching what you've been doing with your nonprofit, and I think you're ready for the next step." Sophia's voice was warm, full of admiration. "There's an opportunity for you to take your work to a national level, to amplify your message on a much broader scale. We're partnering with major organizations to bring awareness to the importance of elevating the voices of everyday workers, and I want you to be a part of it. I'd love to discuss how we can work together." The offer was more than Emma could have ever imagined. National exposure, a larger platform for the very people her nonprofit aimed to support. She had always believed in the power of elevating voices that had been ignored for so long. But this was an opportunity to reach a much broader audience and make a significant, lasting impact. Yet, Emma hesitated. The scale of it all, the responsibility, felt daunting. Could she handle it? Sophia, sensing Emma's hesitation, continued, "I know this may seem like a big leap, but it's not about you, Emma. It's about the people who need to be heard. Your mother's story has already changed so many lives. You're a living testament to what's possible when we support each other, when we lift one another up. Let us help you take your work even further." That evening, Emma sat in the quiet of her office, reflecting on everything that had led her here. She thought about her mother, Linda, whose simple, daily acts of kindness had reverberated far beyond the small corner of the world she inhabited. Linda's legacy had been built on love and hard work, and now Emma was standing at the edge of something much larger than herself, something that could touch the lives of so many more. With renewed clarity, Emma made her decision. She called Sophia the next morning. "I'm in," Emma said, her voice firm but filled with gratitude. "Let's take this to the next level. Let's do it for the people who need us most." The next few months were a whirlwind of planning, partnership building, and raising awareness. Emma's partnership with Sophia and her organization had opened doors to new collaborations, expanded resources, and partnerships with major companies who shared the same vision of empowering overlooked workers. Emma found herself on stages and panels, speaking with other influential leaders who had recognized the importance of amplifying these voices. As her presence in the public eye grew, so did the impact of Visible Voices. The organization expanded its reach to more cities, providing scholarships, job training, and emotional support to communities nationwide. The message behind Emma's mother's story, the value of work, the dignity of every person, and the power of selfless love had become a movement. What had started as a personal healing journey had now become a nationwide effort to bring respect, opportunity, and empowerment to those who had long been overlooked. Yet, even as Emma's work grew on a national scale, she made sure to stay connected to the roots of her journey. She continued to speak at local community centers, visiting families and workers in the very neighborhoods she had once called home. She never lost sight of the humble beginnings that had shaped her and Linda's story. She was still that young girl who had been embarrassed by her mother's work, and she was still the woman who had come to realize that her mother was not just a street vendor but a hero. One afternoon, as Emma was preparing for a speech at a large conference, she received a letter in the mail. The letter was from a young woman named Hannah, who had recently graduated college with a scholarship provided by Visible Voices. Hannah's letter was heartfelt and moving, as she recounted how much the scholarship had meant to her and how it had allowed her to pursue her dreams despite the financial struggles she faced as a first-generation college student. "I can't begin to express how much this scholarship has changed my life," Hannah wrote. "It's more than just the financial support, it's the fact that someone believed in me. Someone saw the potential in me. I'm where I am today because of you, because of your mother's story, because of everything you're doing to change lives. Thank you." Emma wiped away a tear as she read the letter. This was why she had started Visible Voices. This was why she had shared her mother's story with the world. Every letter like this, every life changed, was a testament to the power of love, of family, and of community. And it was all built on the foundation that Linda had laid. That evening, as Emma stood in front of a packed auditorium at the conference, ready to share the next chapter of the Visible Voices story, she paused for a moment. She thought of her mother, of Linda, who had never asked for fame or recognition. Linda had never sought anything more than to give her daughter a chance at a better life. But in her own quiet way, Linda had changed the world. And Emma, standing there with the world now listening, had the privilege of carrying her legacy forward. With a deep breath, Emma took the stage. She looked out at the crowd, her heart full of love, gratitude, and determination. "I'm here today," Emma began, "because of one simple truth: every person deserves to be seen. Every person deserves to be heard. My mother, my hero, taught me that. And I stand here now with all of you to continue that work. Together, we can create a world where every voice is valued, where every story matters." And with those words, Emma knew that the journey she had started all those years ago of understanding, healing, and honoring her mother's legacy was just beginning. The story of Linda Clark was far from over. It was living on, in every life touched, in every voice raised, and in every heart that beat a little bit stronger for having been seen. As the months turned into years, Emma continued to lead Visible Voices with passion and commitment, transforming it into a powerful movement. The nonprofit had grown into a national organization, with chapters in cities across the country, and its work was increasingly recognized by corporate partners, community leaders, and activists. The focus had always remained on elevating the stories of those whose contributions had been overlooked, just as Emma had once overlooked her mother's sacrifices. And now, the ripple effect of Linda's legacy had reached people from all walks of life. Emma had become a figure of inspiration, but she never let the spotlight overshadow the cause. Every time she spoke at conferences or appeared on TV, she made sure to bring it back to the heart of the message, honoring the unseen heroes, like her mother, who had shaped the world quietly but profoundly. One day, after a particularly exhausting week of meetings and interviews, Emma returned to her apartment. She had just finished her speech at a global conference on workers' rights, where she had shared her mother's story, and she was mentally drained. But as she stepped into her living room, something caught her eye: a photo of Linda, sitting behind her food cart, a wide smile on her face, looking out at the camera as though she knew, even then, that she was making a difference. Emma sat down in front of the photo, her hands resting gently on the table. She thought back to the beginning, to the little girl who had been embarrassed by her mother's work, the woman who had distanced herself from the love and sacrifice that had always been so constant. The journey had been long, and at times it had felt like an uphill climb, but Emma had come so far. She had healed, and in doing so, had honored her mother in the best way possible, by continuing the work she had started. As she sat there, a feeling of contentment washed over her. She had never imagined this life, this sense of purpose, when she was younger. The shame that had once defined her had melted away. The weight of judgment from her family and society no longer had a hold on her. Linda's story had become not only her own, but the story of countless others who had felt forgotten or unimportant. Emma's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She stood and opened it to find Rachel standing there, holding a large envelope. Her face was bright with excitement, and Emma couldn't help but smile at the sight of her old friend. "I've got something for you," Rachel said, grinning. Emma raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Rachel handed her the envelope. "It's from the National Museum of History. They've been following your work with Visible Voices, and they want to do an entire section dedicated to your mother's story and the impact it's had on you. They're launching a permanent exhibit on community heroes, and they want your family's story to be a part of it." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Another exhibit? She had never imagined that something so monumental would come to her mother's memory. After the museum exhibit in Denver, she had thought that was the final tribute to Linda's legacy. But now, it was clear that the story was continuing to unfold, growing larger and reaching more people. Rachel grinned, her eyes twinkling. "I know, right? They want to feature the heroine behind the street vendor cart alongside other important stories of community impact." "Emma, this is huge." Emma's hands trembled as she opened the letter, reading it over a few times to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. The letter outlined the details of the collaboration with the National Museum of History and how Linda's story, along with Emma's work, would be featured in a new section about unsung heroes from all walks of life. Emma felt a surge of pride, knowing that her mother's legacy was being honored on such a grand scale. She looked up at Rachel, her voice soft. This is more than I could have ever imagined. I didn't expect any of this. I never imagined we'd be a part of something so important." Rachel wrapped her arms around her in a tight hug. "You did it, Emma. You gave your mother the recognition she deserved, and more. You've shared her story with the world, and in doing so, you've helped so many others. Your mom would be so proud of you." Emma closed her eyes, the tears coming without warning. She had come so far, so much further than she had ever thought possible. And it was all because of Linda's quiet strength, her unconditional love, and her unshakable belief in Emma. Emma had carried her mother's spirit with her every step of the way, but now, in this moment, she felt it more than ever. "This is just the beginning," Emma whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "This is the beginning of something much bigger than I ever imagined." Rachel nodded, a knowing smile on her face. "Exactly. And it's all because you're willing to share your truth. You've given people a voice. You've given them hope." With the announcement of the new exhibit, Visible Voices began to grow even more rapidly. The recognition from the National Museum of History not only brought attention to the work the nonprofit was doing, but also highlighted the importance of honoring those who often go unnoticed in society. Emma became more determined than ever to continue her mother's mission, and now, with the support of the museum and the increasing recognition of Visible Voices, She knew that Linda's legacy would continue to grow, impacting more lives, inspiring more people, and changing the narrative of how society viewed the so-called invisible workers. The opening of the exhibit at the National Museum of History was a grand event, with politicians, activists, and community leaders coming together to celebrate the unsung heroes of society. As Emma stood in front of her mother's display, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride. The display wasn't just a tribute to Linda, it was a celebration of every person who had worked tirelessly, without recognition, to build the world around them. As people walked through the exhibit, they were drawn not just to Linda's story, but to the story of a woman who had dedicated herself to uplifting others, who had taught her daughter, through her example, that every life, no matter how humble, had value. In the final moments of the event, Emma spoke to a crowd that had gathered around the exhibit. With a calm but resolute voice, she said, "My mother may have been a street vendor, but she was also a teacher, a mentor, and a hero. Her life was not measured by the work she did, but by the love she gave. And through her, I've learned that every person, no matter their job, their background, or their struggles, deserves to be seen. This exhibit is not just about my mother. It's about every unsung hero who has ever worked behind the scenes to make the world a better place." The crowd erupted into applause, and Emma's heart swelled with emotion. She had come full circle, from the ashamed daughter who couldn't face her mother's work to the woman standing proudly before a room full of people, honoring the legacy of the woman who had changed her life. As the event concluded, Emma stood quietly by the display, a sense of peace settling over her. The path had been long and challenging, but it had been worth every step. And now, as Linda's story continued to inspire others, Emma knew that the journey was far from over. In the end, Emma had learned that heroes didn't need recognition, they didn't need grand gestures or monuments to prove their worth. They simply needed to be loved, to be seen, and to make the world a better place in their own quiet way. And as Emma stood there, surrounded by the love and admiration of the community she had helped build, she felt her mother's presence more strongly than ever. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. "You were always my hero." As the months after the museum exhibit unfolded, Emma continued to pour her heart and energy into Visible Voices, expanding the scope of the organization's impact. The spotlight from the National Museum of History exhibit had brought even more attention to the cause, and soon, Emma found herself traveling more frequently to advocate for workers' rights and community empowerment. But despite the rising profile and the widespread recognition, Emma remained grounded in the mission her mother had set before her, ensuring that no one felt invisible again. One evening, as Emma sat at her desk preparing for a new round of speaking engagements, she received a letter from an old acquaintance, one she hadn't spoken to in years. It was from her estranged father, Samuel Clark. The letter was short, but the words were filled with emotion. "Dear Emma, I've spent years regretting my absence from your life, and I'm finally writing to tell you that I see you now. I've been following your work from afar, and I'm incredibly proud of what you've done. I've always regretted not being there for you, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope we can have the chance to speak and maybe begin to heal the wounds that have been between us for all these years. If you're open to it, I'd like to meet and talk. No expectations, just a conversation. Samuel." Emma read the letter several times. The father who had abandoned her and her mother so long ago had suddenly reached out. It was an unexpected, almost surreal moment. She had spent so many years trying to prove herself, to show the world that she didn't need him, that she could be strong without his presence. But now, the offer to reconnect felt like a chance for closure, a chance to heal wounds that had remained buried deep within her. For days, Emma wrestled with the decision. She had come so far, and she wasn't sure if reopening the door to her past was the right choice. Her relationship with her father had always been complicated, full of disappointment and unanswered questions. But as she reflected on everything she had learned from her mother's story, she realized that part of her own healing came from the ability to forgive, to face the unresolved pieces of her past, and to take control of her narrative. After much contemplation, Emma picked up the phone and dialed the number her father had included in the letter. The conversation was brief, and they agreed to meet at a small cafe in the city, a neutral ground. Emma's heart raced as the meeting day approached. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this was a crucial step for her own peace of mind. When the day finally arrived, Emma arrived early, seated at a corner table, watching the people around her. The cafe was warm, and the sound of clinking mugs and quiet conversations filled the space. When Samuel walked in, he looked older than she remembered, his hair graying, his face etched with years of regret and time. He seemed unsure of how to approach, but when he saw Emma, his eyes softened, and he walked toward her. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice tinged with guilt and hope. "It's good to see you." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her emotions swirling. For so many years, she had convinced herself that she didn't need him. But now, sitting across from him, she realized that she wasn't the same person who had walked away from him years ago. She had grown, learned, and healed, and now she had the power to decide what kind of relationship, if any, she wanted with him. "You too," Emma replied. Her voice was steady, but her heart was racing. "I didn't expect this, but I'm willing to listen." They talked for hours that day. It was awkward at first, filled with tentative apologies and small talk. But as the conversation wore on, Emma began to understand that Samuel's absence from her life hadn't been because he didn't care, it had been because he didn't know how to love her. He had never been taught to love, had never been able to face his own flaws and regrets. The distance between them wasn't just a physical one, it was emotional. Something he had created to protect himself from the shame he had carried for years. "I know I've failed you," Samuel admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I can never undo the pain I caused. I didn't know how to be the father you needed. But I've been watching you, Emma. You've done so much. You've become a woman I never thought I'd see." Emma listened, allowing the words to sink in. Her father had been absent, but it was clear that the weight of that absence had been something he carried with him. She realized then that forgiveness wasn't just for him, it was for her. It was for her own healing, her own peace of mind. "I've struggled with what you did, with the way you left," Emma began. "But I've also learned that part of my strength comes from finding peace in letting go. You can't change the past, and I can't erase the hurt, but I can choose how I move forward from here." There was silence between them, a heavy but necessary pause. Then Samuel spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I want to try, Emma. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." Emma took a deep breath, looking at the man in front of her. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying the weight of her father's absence anymore. She could choose to build something new, a relationship rooted not in the past, but in the present and future. "I'm not sure where to start," Emma said, her voice soft. "But we can start with today. We can take it slow. And we can see where it goes." And with that, the door to a new chapter opened. The weeks that followed were filled with cautious steps. Emma and Samuel began to rebuild their relationship, one conversation at a time. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was honest. Emma learned that forgiveness wasn't always about excusing the past, it was about freeing herself from the burden of it. She had spent so many years feeling like she had to prove her worth without her father's presence, but now she could let go of that need. She was worthy because of who she was, not because of anyone's approval, not even her father's. Through all of this, visible voices continued to flourish. The nonprofit expanded its mission, reaching even more workers and communities in need, and Emma found herself more dedicated than ever to the cause. Her mother's legacy had set the foundation for this work, and now Emma was building something that would outlive her own lifetime. As the sun began to set over Denver one evening, Emma sat at her desk, looking at the photograph of Linda. Her heart was full, knowing that her mother's quiet strength and selfless love had not only shaped her life, but was now shaping the lives of countless others. The journey she had started of understanding her mother, of healing her own wounds, and of honoring Linda's legacy had taken Emma to places she never could have imagined. And in that moment, Emma smiled, knowing that Linda would always be with her. In every person she helped, in every life she touched, and in the unspoken bond between mother and daughter. Linda's legacy was alive, and it was stronger than ever.